First of all, I'm really honored to follow George not once but twice. As he noted, I was with the Trump administration, and I was quite honored to follow in a little bit of what George had done in the previous administration. I am with the University of Southern California's Commercial Spaceflight Initiative, which is a new organization that I am launching on campus to connect business scholars with the commercial space industry. And I'm excited to talk to anybody here that I haven't already talked to or invited out to our workshop in November. And speaking of administrations, I want to say that obviously administrations disagree on a lot of things, but one thing three presidents that I have a lot of respect for have agreed on is commercial space. And along that lines of nonpartisanship, I want to point out this is the Trump team in February in NASA headquarters up on the 9th floor when Charlie Bolden came back to do some sort of paperwork he had to do or something. And I want to point out we were all really excited to see Charlie there. The work that his group did, the work that George did, laid the groundwork for everything that's possible happening today. And we all, I think, need to work together to keep space being the relatively nonpartisan place that it is. We have our disagreements, but they tend to be more about geography. They tend to be more about congressional districts. Let's keep it nonpartisan. President Reagan and people in Congress at that time had the foresight to put together the Commercial Space Launch Act, and I think it was one of the most important things that the United States government has done in the history of the United States government. Not only did they realize that there were going to be commercial actors, but they realized that we needed to encourage, facilitate, and support their actions, and that we wanted to have economic growth and that we wanted to have entrepreneurship. That by commercial, they didn't simply mean paying the existing traditional military-industrial complex differently. They meant competition, they meant entrepreneurship. The Obama administration latched onto this properly and did a really, really great job with the COTS program. And this is something I point out is active industrial policy. Some of you may know that separately from the space world, I have a particular interest in the way that U.S. positions itself in international competition. And I think there are times when the role of government is appropriate to identify new industries, whether those are the internet, whether it's transcontinental railroads, whether it's telephone system, and make sure that those things happen and that they happen well, and that the United States moves forward as the global leader in those categories. COTS was important in this way. It addressed real needs that NASA had. It did that cost effectively. It supported other national needs that the U.S. has. We've seen the cost of DoD and other three-letter agency launches go down because of the fact that NASA did COTS. It provided system redundancy. So when we had progress failures, when we had failures in one COTS systems or another COTS systems, we didn't end up with a space station that had no supplies. This was really, really important and something that we don't normally get out of a NASA program, which is two entirely different launch vehicles launching out of entirely different facilities using entirely different technologies on first stage, second stage, and on delivery vehicles. It spurred competition. So again, it wasn't just what we got out of COTS. We might have put $400 million into SpaceX and another $400 million or so into orbital ATK and ended up with two vehicles, but we drove the cost of space launch to low Earth orbit down by an incredible amount in a very short period of time. It helped us develop a variety of new technologies in order to get to that point, and it had net positive trade flows. As somebody else mentioned earlier, we've recaptured a significant portion of the international launch business, something that we had abdicated entirely, a business that the U.S. had formed previously. COTS did all of that for us. And it's enabled a wide variety of applications, many of which we don't know what they are yet. And that's what I'm really excited to look forward to, because by driving that cost down and driving it down continuously, so you've got companies like SpaceX that not just made launch cheaper in order to do COTS, they kept making it cheaper. They wouldn't stop. They kept iterating and improving the rocket, which irritated the heck out of some people, obviously. And now they are working on bringing it back and reusing it. And of course, the first few times they reused it, there probably wasn't a real economic benefit, but they're now getting to the point where they're at that tipping point where the reuse is actually going to deliver the economic cost and drive costs lower. When you do that, You enable, I don't know what applications, but you've got the same process that you had back in the 1980s with the microprocessor, where the cost of computing continued to go down, 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 and that was the basic fundamental driver of everything that happened around that industry. A lot of what I said here is based on an article I did for New Space Journal. If you're not a subscriber to New Space Journal, I want to encourage you to do so. This is Scott Hubbard's publication out of Stanford, and it is a peer-reviewed journal that covers the broad variety of business technology and exploration that happens in the commercial space world. So this is commercial. So you can see that the blue line at the bottom is SpaceX grabbing that market, and they're not grabbing that market from other US competitors because the US competitors didn't care because they had been put in an economic environment created by the government that did not motivate them to care about that market. They had a particular gravy train for doing what they did, and they did that very, very well and reliably, and that was all they cared about. And they let the rest of the world take over that economic market. You can't sustain your military launch environment if you don't also go after the commercial launch environment, because your international competitors will gain the efficiencies that come from working in the competitive economic environment, and they will eventually outdo you militarily. It's the same reason you can't have an economy that only builds an F-35. You have to build cars, you have to build aircraft, you have to have a manufacturing base that supports all that. So Commercial Crew. Commercial Crew follows on COTS. It does a lot of the same things right. We've got two competitors with beautiful vehicles. I would be excited to fly on either one. In fact, I've got a picture of myself in the CST-100 is my social media avatar. But it's behind schedule because space is hard. And often it's behind schedule because the process has been at least as challenging as the engineering. Working with NASA, the budget cuts that the Congress kind of snuck out of the program over time and other requirements made it really difficult. The participants in this program have been held to a higher standard than any previous NASA manned space capsule. We certainly didn't do a lot of abort testing with the space shuttle before we stuck people in and flew it. And interestingly, yet they're also held hostage to the past, and this is kind of a dichotomy. You've got to do things better than we did in the past, but we're going to continually compare you to the way we did things in the past. I would sit in meetings during the transition team talking about Commercial Crew and the vehicles that it might launch on, and people would say that's not the way we did it in the space shuttle, as though the space shuttle should be held up as some sort of standard for flight safety. So the president has issued 3 space policy directives, as we've noted. The first one, the part that I think is important, is that we're going to lead an innovative and sustainable program of exploration with commercial and international partners to enable human expansion across the solar system and bring back to Earth new knowledge and opportunities. It's really important to realize that when you do sustainable and commercial, then the science follows. So I get a lot of science folks that are like, oh, this commercial thing is a distraction from doing the important job that NASA is supposed to do as a science agency. Well, if the National Science Foundation wanted to send somebody to Patagonia to I don't know, do a paper on some Argentine mole, they wouldn't build an aircraft to send the researchers there, right? The fact of building the aircraft would be a distraction from doing the science. So NASA needs to understand and get in the same program that whenever possible, not just occasionally or as a nod to policy, but whenever possible, using commercial solutions are what's going to make science work easier. As soon as we have regular commercial flights to LEO, as soon as we have regular commercial flights to the moon, the amount of science we're going to do is going to amaze us. And that's going to enable us to do the astrophysics and the earth sciences and all the other things we want to do too for orders of magnitude cheaper. And we've already heard that from the great presentation about what S&D is doing with CubeSats and small satellites. It's already beginning to pay off. Let's not turn back on that in any way. Space Policy Directive 2 talks about regulations and, importantly, encourage American leadership in space commerce. So there's no doubt that the goal is to make sure that we are leading in the space business, and that means competitively internationally. And there's an overall mission. We're going to return humans to the moon for long term, and we're going to utilize things on the moon, followed by missions to Mars and other destinations. But this long-term utilization comes together in what I think are the fundamental goals of the administration's policy. First of all, permanent, sustainable. We're going to keep doing it. and economic growth is what makes permanent and sustainable possible, because your tax dollars under a growing entitlement wave are not going to make space permanent or sustainable. I love NASA. I think its budget's too small. I think our entire science budget is too small. In fact, the amount of money that the United States government spends on anything to do with the future or future generations is absolutely inadequate. If you take that budget and you look at the total budget that's being spent on Medicare and everything else that has to do with the past and the small few percent that are being spent on the future, it's a travesty. But the fact of the matter is, if you want those things to continue, advocating for them won't solve the problem, because the entitlement wave is unstoppable. The only thing that will solve the problem is using this rare opportunity we have right now, and this is our very last chance to create a sustainable and permanent presence in space based on real economic growth. And you've got to let people go there and do business and use resources and take risk and do the things that it's necessary to push a frontier economically. If you don't do that, you can give up on space, because you're not going to get it out of tax dollars. So we've got this amazing, rare alignment of the planets. You've got the White House, you've got Congress on board, you've got commercial capabilities, and you've got an international challenge from our friends in China and Russia to provoke us, as well as our international friends in Europe and elsewhere to work with. This hasn't happened at least since the Apollo days. And even more importantly, we've got commercial. And I apologize, the fonts changed when we went from Mac to PC, so I'm actually a little bit better at doing layout than that. But we're going to do this commercially. We've got FAA-AST. I was really impressed with what Kelvin had to say earlier. They have done an incredible job dealing with a tidal wave of licensing and regulatory obligations, while at the same time being directed to change everything. You've got the Department of Commerce. Wilbur Ross is really excited, and he understands space. When was the last time we had a Secretary of Commerce who loved and understood space? The DoD is on board with commercial and looking at new ways of engaging entrepreneurship. And the public loves it. All of a sudden, my students are excited. I've always been a space geek. I'm a number one of these 50-something guys who grew up sitting on the couch watching Buzz and Neil on the moon, and we were inspired. But for a long time, the kids cared more about the internet or their smartphones. That has flipped in the last 5 years or so, and I can tell you they're very, very excited. And I'll tell you something else that might surprise you. I use a clicker-based audience response system to poll my students who are upper division undergrad students, typically not in engineering, but all across the campus. And I ask them what they know about space. Basically, all of them know who Elon Musk is and what SpaceX is, and they saw Falcon Heavy, all of them almost. Probably 80% of them are aware that Jeff Bezos has a space program going. Probably about 80% of them know about Virgin Galactic, what Richard Branson is doing. Maybe 15% of them have heard the word Space Launch System, okay? I don't care how many tweets NASA puts out or how many followers they have. That's a very specific group of people, and it isn't necessarily escaping in the same way or with the same enthusiasm that the commercial side is. It's not to say it's bad, but you should just be aware of that. Do not blow this opportunity. This confluence will never come again in the history of our country. And if we don't take advantage of moving to this next frontier, I don't know where our country ends up being. So here's the current program, and yeah, I know you've seen that slide before, and I love this slide, so you're going to see it a lot. So you've got this very linear business plan approach, and we used to teach business plans in business schools back in the 1980s until we realized that was a really bad thing, because you create this very linear view of the future that has a number of critical path dependencies and doesn't take into account that the environment will change over time and that new technologies will develop and regulatory and political and all sorts of cultural changes will change your business. Well, the same thing happens in space, and you create this linear path and you find out that some of the dependencies don't work. Now, I'm curious, what is the date on that? And that's been kind of ambiguous to me. So, okay, that's going to happen. The small commercial landers are going to happen, I think, mostly because it's commercial. That looks like it's going to get pushed out based on stuff I see coming out of the OIG report. That might happen because that is scheduled to launch on an unspecified commercial vehicle. These dates are all looking like they're going to slide if what I'm reading in the press is true. So when does that happen then? Probably happens like that under the current plan, in my opinion. Okay? That is unacceptable. So first of all, if you just simply use commercial launchers in this market as an opportunity, and hopefully an opportunity to spur the traditional launchers, I think you can push these dates forward. That's incredibly aggressive, but I think that's in line with what the administration wanted to have. And if you do that, you can have a program that hopefully won't be flipped over by the next administration. Because where is the asteroid redirect mission? I don't know. It didn't happen. And credit to the people at NASA that worked on ARM. They worked on the SCP first and the parts that were valuable in that mission, understanding that the mission itself was not the goal. So there are two paths that we can get to where we want to go on the moon. No, actually there are several. I found this on Reddit, right? So dock the BFS with the LOPG. Interestingly, if you dig into the details that Gers put together, he's very clear that it will be accessible from commercial ships, so good. We have an embarrassment of riches. We've got an incredible giant launch vehicle coming out, the biggest in the world. We have a variety of commercial vehicles that are all using innovative ways to reuse the core systems and drive the economics down. So I have a modest proposal. Let's do a two-track competition. Do not go on a linear path where you might have a single point of failure in a program or programs that are obviously slipping. So SLS, first of all, let's move it to fixed fee launches. They're about $1.5 billion each. Just fix it at that, let's be honest. Maybe about 8 of them will get you to boots on the surface of the moon. It'll cost you about $12 billion. Personally, I'd be fine with that, and I think that that's probably what's baked in the cake. You're going to spend another $5 billion on LOPG, and so you're going to end up at about $20 billion there. At the same time, put up some prizes for the commercial sector. I think a $2 billion first prize for boots on the moon and a $1 million second prize, so neither of the companies that are actually likely to pursue this thinks it's a lost game, makes sense. And you could throw $5 billion if you wanted to for boots on the surface of Mars. And I think this might happen, but if it doesn't happen, it doesn't cost you anything, okay? If it does happen, and the other thing happens too, then great. Don't blow this opportunity again. You don't get these guys like every 10 years popping along saying that they're going to dedicate their whole lives and some of the world's biggest fortunes to the industry that you love and the future that you want to see for your kids. Do not sacrifice that future that our kids want in order to satisfy whatever parochial needs you might have now. So I get another question about this. Show me the permanent part of this. Show me the economic growth part of this. Show me the sustainable part of this. I love all of this, but it's not enough. So what's missing? Commercial infrastructure is what's missing. And again, apologies on the fonts. Dan Rasky is going to be talking a little bit later, but his group, the Space Portal at Ames, I think has a really important idea about what we can do quickly with commercial infrastructure that's critical. What's the biggest problem with being on the moon? It's the day-night cycle and the energy needs there when you're on the moon. They have a proposal to use medium-sized landers to put power stations on the moon, power stations that will provide you with navigation and communications information as well. But basically, we've got big battery packs, we've got solar panels that can be utilized for ISRU and can be utilized for explorers and for other missions on the lunar surface that need continual power during the night cycle. The gateway modules. This has been a really good choice that NASA's done, and in particular, I point out that the SEP module, the Advanced Propulsion Element, is competitive, and what's going on there is really, really interesting and aggressive time-wise. This is the way we should be thinking. I really like the fact that you got Lockheed's proposal, refurbishes Heritage Heart, where they actually have modules that could be used for this and tied to existing SEP systems and get them out there. Northrop is using an existing vehicle and modifying it. This is scrappy. And Nanorac's idea to use converted upper stages, using converted upper stages, people have been talking about since, as far as I can remember, back in the 1980s, about using shuttle external tanks, and even before that, we need to do that. So that said, I am on time, and you do not have to come up here with a hook, and you may ask me questions. Thank you.
So, Greg, I want to congratulate you. You're the first guy that I haven't had to stand up for.
That's because I'm commercial.
You're okay. Unfortunately, we haven't gotten too many questions.
I worked for the government for a little bit of time, but it didn't run.
We need some more questions here, so folks, ask your questions. I just want to say one thing before we get started. One of the big fears in this business is that every, 2 years from now or 6 years from now, we'll get a new administration, policies will change, direction will change. Those of us that have been around for more than a couple of years
Or the
have seen
president will tweet something at 2 in the morning?
Yeah, something. So again, why is this plan going to be proof against the next guy saying, I don't want to do what the last guy did?
Yeah, and that's my concern. It's not proof if we don't move quickly and put some stakes in the ground in an aggressive way. So I like the fact that we're getting that first module up there in a reasonable amount of time. That was part of what we talked about on the transition team, and I think it's really incredible. But letting those dates slide out to where they are is not good enough. We need to leverage our commercial vendors to move those dates forward. If we don't do that, then it's just another asteroid redirect mission that'll end up being on the back burner of whatever the next administration is. And we'll be lucky if the next administration has another space plan. There's a very good chance the next administration's plan will be all about whatever social concerns they have, bless their hearts, and space will not be on the burner at all.
Okay, from the audience then, should we partner with China in space?
I think somebody else answered that brilliantly earlier. If you don't know, I'm the co-author of a book, Death by China, and wearing my other hat, I have a real interest in U.S. trade policy. My co-author is the president's advisor on trade, Peter Navarro, who is the one running the tariff game that you probably see. So I'm a cynic on that. I love the Chinese people, their enthusiasm, the amount of genius that they brought to space, going all the way back before America had a space program, to a brilliant Chinese scientist at Caltech who helped get us where we are. That said, their government is deplorable, and I don't want a country's government who has 1 million Muslims locked up in re-education camps in East Turkestan, being re-educated out of their religion, carrying humanity's banner forward into the future. So just my personal answer, no.
Okay. Do you think we ought to continue with Russia as a partner in space?
That's problematic, and I was a big advocate, I would point out, of pressuring for the removal of the RD-180 engines, which I know didn't win me some fans at the time. In fact, I wrote an article on that John McCain called a must-read article. So I have been cynical about the current Russian regime. I'm no fan. That said, we have a long-standing operational history with the Russians, and we've worked together good with them. And I would like to find a way for that to continue, but I would love to see that regime return to the state that it was in when we chose to begin working with them in space, which was not the current regime.
I was going to say something clever about drilling holes in spaceships, but it probably couldn't come on.
Yeah, that's that.
So, question from the floor, and I'm going to read this. I'm not sure I quite understand this question, so I'm just going to read it the way it's written. You said Dragon 2 and CST-100 were behind due to being hard and process or NASA issues. Mm-hmm. Dragon is behind, this is the person asking the question, Dragon is behind due to inadequate systems engineering and problems that cropped up with integration. As a supplier for systems on all three, that it is untrue that requirements for commercial were harder than is implied. Orion, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I didn't say they were harder than they were for Orion. I said they were harder than they were for past systems. So no, Orion did its first flight test, I think back in 2014 on the Delta launch, and is being subject to escape tests and all of the other things that that probably it should be, and that's great. So I want to be clear about that. I was not referring to Orion. I was referring to the fact that I would sit in a meeting and have somebody start talking about space shuttle procedures. If they wanted to talk about Orion procedures, that would have made a lot more sense. So yeah, Dragon is behind for technical reasons, just as CST-100 has obviously some issues with some thrusters there that leak hypergolics. Space is hard, and so that's what I meant here. There's been very few programs that get done on time. Nobody expects, I think, when Elon Musk makes a pronouncement about when something's going to fly, that it's going to happen on that date, but they'd be foolish to think that it won't happen.
Okay. And then we have someone that's interested in a history question.
Okay.
You failed to mention that the traditional launch environment lost its market share because NASA chose a policy in the 1970s to push commercial launches to shuttle, which precipitated a highly subsidized competitor in Ariane. Ariane could offer insurance not available to the U.S. launchers due to government policy. Comments?
Yeah, no, that is absolutely true. So we put all our eggs in one basket again, and we had a single dependency business plan where this was going to be the future, and we'd drawn out that chart that looked a lot like that with the shuttle, and guess what? It turned out not to be true. And so then we had to run and try to do EELV, and of course the competitors ended up having some issues with each other, and we had to form ULA, and all those things happened. That is interesting history, and we don't want to repeat it. So what we don't want to do, and I think station is a really interesting question there, is to subsidize a government system that isn't commercially efficient, and I'm not saying that that's the case in station, but you've got to think carefully about it, nor abandon such a system until you have a commercial alternative. So we'd never want to be in the situation where we've got this one government thing and it's competing against other international players, because we have strong competitors in Europe and China. The Russians might get their act back together, in which case we need to be prepared. But the way we're going to be prepared is by using our commercial vendors when they are capable and ready, and insisting that they are so.
Do you think there's any validity to the Gateway, the Lunar Orbiting Gateway, supporting a commercial enterprise on the moon?
I'm excited about Gateway, frankly, and I know that there are a lot of people on the commercial side that view it as, I've heard the phrase from somebody about the toll booth, and they don't like it because it's a NASA program. No, I think it's a good program, and we need to go with it. And again, it's a small amount of money out of the total federal budget. The problem isn't how much of the NASA budget you spend on this or that program. It's the fact that the NASA budget is not big enough to begin with. As far as the commercial applications of that, the fact that we're bringing in all those different vendors and innovative people like NanoRacks, along with traditional vendors who are thinking completely differently, like what Lockheed is proposing, I'm excited about that. I think it'll make it much more commercial, much more manageable than Station. Station's a complex entity that wasn't designed to be commercial, so what Casis has done there has been great, but it's been hard. If we think more about commercial from the beginning as we work on LOB-G, then I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Very good. Well, we got a couple more minutes, but we're out of questions. So, Greg, I want to tell you that I find your talk extremely interesting.
Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you for
Glad to be on time.